Hi everybody, and welcome back to Scary Nightmare. I promise you in this episode, I will tell the story in a way that was never told like before. So stay tuned. Quickly before I begin, just make sure to let me know where you're watching from and what time is it for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come on, what are you waiting for? Subscribe now, as I promise to always bring you the hottest stories that are out there. And for those who haven't watched part 1 yet, please, I highly encourage you to go ahead and watch from part 1. As this story is quite a bit long and is filled with details, and if you just began from this part, I don't know if you might understand it fully or no, but part 1 is very important. And with that being said, let's continue the rest of the story. Self-preservation might not be most redeeming quality, so when I saw a figure walking around in the overwhelming darkness, my first instinct was to help them. That fact, mixed with the skull-crushing headache I'd received as a parting gift from the alcohol, caused me to fuck up monumentally enough to call out into the dark. There on the streets, hundreds of dark figures approached me, mere shadows with humanoid features barely resembling people. While they hadn't necessarily seen me, they definitely heard me idiotically call out through the window. I ducked down of sight and closed the blinds. I contemplated whether I should leave the light off to keep myself hidden or turn it on to fight the darkness. Then I noticed a few scribbles in a piece of paper posted under the light switch. Leaving that on, I turned on every switch I could find, hoping it could repel the bizarre creatures from entering my temporary home. Then after I locked all doors and windows, I collected my mobile phone, my gun, and the provided flashlight before boarding myself up inside the pantry. And with little hesitation, I decided to call the sheriff again, hoping he could give me some further instructions on how to survive the oncoming nightmare. Alas, despite my best efforts, the call wouldn't go through. I glanced down at my service weapon and considered whether hiding or escape would be my best option. But even if bullets could maim the creatures, I wouldn't have nearly enough ammunition to put a dent in the horde. Literally, guys, my only option was to just be hidden inside until the darkness rescinded. I mean, the driver had told me earlier that only a couple of hours would pass while the darkness loomed over us. And while I prayed that was true, something within me felt instinctively doubtful. I kept as quiet as I could, keeping my eyes fixed on the door in front of me and a hand on a gun while I couldn't hear the creatures move around. I know they'd gotten close once the lights outside the pantry started to dim. It wasn't as if the lights died, but more like their presence literally just swallowed the light. The sliver of light that sneaked in under the door had all but vanished. I had little more than the weak light bulb inside the pantry, and my exceptionally strong flashlight left to keep my company. Hours passed, and I held my breath as I awaited what felt like my inevitable demise. Then days passed as well, and the darkness remained. I tried my best to preserve the battery on my phone, only turning it on a few hours to check the time and attempting to call for backup. I managed to keep the phone going for a week before it eventually died. I mean, even if I had the charger with me, there were no outlets to connect it to. The pantry itself had become a disgusting prison. Food and water wasn't exactly a scarce resource, but dealing with my bathroom habits made me weigh the pros and cons of consuming anything more than absolute necessities. Time became a foreign concept without my phone to keep track of it. I had to rely on my own internal clock, which had been wrecked by the lack of a day and night cycle. Based on the growth of my beard, I assumed 2 weeks had passed by the time I looked at my gun as more of a way out than means of self-defense. By then, the light outside my door had completely vanished. It had taken the creatures a long time to consume all the light, but once they were done, I could see silvers of shadow penetrate from under the door. I shined my light at it, which seemed to keep them at bay. But I only had so much battery power, including the extra batteries left in the pantry. Day by day, my sanity started to fade. Every thought was occupied by the immense desire to escape, be it through a heroic act of defiance or by a bullet to my own head. Then, as if a switch had been flicked, a beam of bright light appeared under the door. A heavily white light, brighter and more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. I stared at it in disbelief. Could this be daylight? I don't know. and I didn't even dare to open the door. I must have sat there for an hour before a familiar voice finally broke my trance. Then all of a sudden I heard a sheriff calling out, "Robert, are you in there?" I carefully started dismantling the makeshift barricade I'd placed in front of the door and stumbled out into the bright hall of my home. The light of day hit me with blinding power. "Thank God, you're still here. We literally thought that we lost you." And that's what Sheriff Riley exclaimed as I opened the door. I kept staring at him for a moment before I fully believed he was real. Then I started stuttering, saying, What happened?" Robert tried to hold back a grimace as he noticed the smell and sight of his own worn-out body. Then the sheriff stepped inside and closed the door to keep me out of sight. I caught a brief glance of my own reflection in the window, greasy hair, untrimmed beard, and bloodshot eyes. Then I asked how long was I in there. The sheriff responded saying 19 days. "It is literally the longest time we've ever," and then he trailed off as he noticed the look of dread on my face. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Robert. I'm very sorry." I then reeked of sweat and shift after being trapped in my own filth for almost 3 weeks. The sheriff seemed slightly fresher than myself, probably having had access to a bathroom. I know it wasn't his fault that I was trapped up in the pantry. If I hadn't called out for the creatures, I could have stayed safely inside my own home and lived an isolated but comfortable life. But here we are. I had a lot of questions, but in my tired state, all I could think of was to clean myself up first. "I'm gonna have a shower," that's what I said. Then he nodded understandingly and said he'd wait for me while I get ready. As I washed the past weeks of my body, I finally started to formulate a plan. I'd been so preoccupied with surviving that I hadn't been able to question the reality of the situation. I decided that the best course of action would be to call headquarters back in the city. I was out of my depth and needed serious reinforcements. Then when I got out from the bathroom, I saw Riley talking on the radio with a distraught expression on his face. So I asked him what's wrong. Then he responded with, "I just got word from the others. We've lost some people. The others are out looking, but the situation seems pretty bleak." That's what he said. I said, "How many?" He said, "I don't know. Current count is literally 24. I said, "Jesus Christ, that's a lot." The longest bout of darkness only lasted a couple of days, and that was almost 30 years ago. This is... The words got stuck in his throat, and he couldn't even complete the sentence. Though he had fared far better than myself in hiding, the people that had been taken were his own, friends and family members that he'd known for his whole entire life. And it had taken a toll on him. A surge of pity filled my body as I realized the true gravity of the situation. Then I said, "Sheriff Riley, we're going to figure this out. Don't worry, I promise you. We just need to get help from the city to let people know what is going on here." He nodded with acceptance, saying, "You're right, but what are we going to tell them?" I said, "The truth. That's what we're gonna tell them." I then immediately charged my phone and attempted to call my supervisor. He was a good, albeit skeptical person, but even he couldn't reject a call for help with several dozen people missing. The phone wouldn't even ring. Not a single bar of signal visible on the little screen. By all accounts, we'd effectively been cut off from civilian. I ran through a few ideas, ready to suggest that we just drive a town over. But before I could formulate a proper plan, someone called Riley over the radio. And then there was that voice of that person saying, "Sheriff, are you there? Can you hear me?" Then the sheriff picked it up and responded, saying, "James, yeah, I'm here. What's going on? We found something at the edge of town. We literally don't know," the officer said with a shaky voice. "Oh God." Then the sheriff asked him, "What did you find?" Then he responded saying, "There was a wall of darkness. It just took loose." And then as he was saying, "We need to get out of," he cut off. And we didn't hear the rest of what he was trying to say. Then after that, Sheriff Riley kept calling his name, asking him if he can hear. "James, can you hear me?" Oh my God. He's not responding. Then he kept repeating himself. And as he was repeating himself, he got no response on the other end. Then I noticed the sheriff turning towards me with terror in his eyes. Then he said, "We have to help them." So we immediately rushed to the car and started speeding towards the border, only stopping briefly at the station to see if anyone had gotten back. But apart from a prison guard to partake in a search and rescue operation, it was seemingly abandoned. The streets were empty, everyone either hiding in their homes, while the police did their search. Yet, despite every available officer being on duty, we were somehow still able to reach any of them through the radio. Then as we were speeding down the road, I started asking, "What are these creatures, and where do they come from?" Riley glanced over at me with a look of confusion on his face, saying, "What creatures?" Then I immediately told him I saw shadows wandering through the dark, just barely resembling humans. There were hundreds of them. Before I could ask any further questions, a car came speeding towards us from the opposite direction. Riley swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding collision, while the other car broke violently, skidding into the ditch. A panicked man stumbled out of the car, his face bruised from the crash. Then Sheriff Riley said, "What the fuck are you doing?" Then James responded saying, "They're all dead. I just left them there. I'm sorry. I couldn't. He stuttered as he frantically looked around. I stared towards the horizon from where James had fled. The light at the horizon seemed to cut off, fading harshly from day to night, as pitch-black clouds were moving towards us. For each second passed, the wall of darkness grew closer and closer. It was what had terrified James and what had killed the others. "Sheriff, we need to move," I said as he tried to comfort James. I turned around and noticed the same darkness had occupied the horizon behind us. By the time we picked James up, the darkness had enveloped the entire town, shrinking by each second passed. To be continued.